All right, welcome everyone. Um, this is the second webinar in our winter webinar series from the Utah Domestic Violence Coalition. And today, I'm excited. We are going to talk about Domestic Violence 101. I am Andy Tremonti with the Utah Domestic Violence Coalition. Some of you may have met me, seen me in other trainings, maybe have heard of my voice in other webinars. um, and I work with the Utah Domestic Violence Coalition. I am the Education Outreach Coordinator, and we're going to go over a little bit more on what that actually entails a little bit later. All right, so I hope you enjoy the webinar as much as I enjoy presenting it. We're going to cover a lot of cool stuff today. Hopefully have a lot of your questions answered, and we will have time throughout this webinar to have some questions, additional questions be answered. All right, so as always, thank you, OVW, the Office of Violence Against Women, for funding this webinar and the work that we do. All right, so if you notice, you have some controls on the right-hand side of your screen. They're going to look very similar to what you see on the screen here. So basically, this little hand with the green arrow under it, that's the raise your hand question, or excuse me, button. So click that to raise your hand, and I'll get a notification, and I will be able to either unmute your microphone, so you will be able to speak, ask questions that way, or I can answer the question that you submitted. Additionally, if you notice here at the bottom of your controls, you will see a little section, a little place for you to submit a question. You may need to expand that by clicking on this little upside down triangle, and then click that and just start typing. And I will get a notification for that as well, and we'll be able to answer your question hopefully in real time. Okay, so Domestic Violence 101 webinar. I added an extra one there. Okay, let's see what we're going to talk about today. So we do want to define what domestic violence is, the legal definition versus lived experience, because oftentimes that's going to be different. It's going to be confusing. It's going to be frustrating for survivors and the advocates who work with survivors. So it's really important to know the definitions of and even the differences between those two. We're also going to go over current rates and trends within the US and within Utah, here in Utah. We're going to be debunking a lot of myths that are related to and surrounding domestic violence. I'm sure you can think of a bunch of different myths just as we get started here. We have someone who has raised their hand already. If you have a question, could you type that really quick into that question box for me? All right. We will be addressing the question, why don't they just leave? Right. That's probably the most asked question that a survivor of domestic and sexual violence gets. Why don't you just leave? Why don't you just, do something or another? Additionally, we will discuss how to respond appropriately. So we're going to talk about things like trauma-informed care, supportive responses versus, even rejecting responses, and responses that can be pretty hurtful for our survivors. And lastly, we're going to review some of the community resources that we have here in Utah and some that we have nationally. All right. First and foremost, who is the person speaking to you right now? Many of you have probably already met me. Many of you maybe have already seen this slide and know exactly what I'm going to say. So I am the Education and Outreach Coordinator for the Utah Domestic Violence Coalition. I have my educational history is in psychology and women and gender studies. I also have around 8 years, definitely starting to get more than that, experience working with LGBTQ survivors of all sorts of trauma and other underserved survivors. About half of that was with youth and the other half with adult survivors of trauma. All right, so here is the first poll. So basically how polls work is a poll will show up on your screen and you will be allowed to answer the question. And it should have popped up for you. So go ahead and just click the answer that best describes you. Are you a victim advocate from a community or a nonprofit? So someone from like South Valley Services, YCC, stuff like that. Are you a victim advocate? Are you a system advocate for maybe a police station, for a county, maybe county office, maybe for a jail, prison, so on? What about government organizations? Do you work with DCFS, maybe DHS, social service organization? So that would be like the road home, places like that, or other. Maybe we have some other folks from different walks of life, and that is awesome. Of course, we love when folks are involved. All right, looks like we have about 75% of folks voted. Let's see if we can get a couple more, and we'll show you these. All right, so the results from that poll should pop up on your screen. All right, looks like we have 56% of folks from that are community advocates, from like a nonprofit. 11% from system advocates, so police, maybe county advocates, and it looks like 11% of government organization folks, maybe DCFS, DHS, and then 22% of other. For the folks that answered other, in your question box here, would you mind typing where you're from? Maybe your job or the stuff that you work on, and we can make sure that we get some of that information directed towards y'all, make it worth your while. All right. There we go. Okay, so what is the Utah Domestic Violence Coalition? Who is the Utah Domestic Violence Coalition? So the UDVC, as I will refer to it as throughout the rest of the webinar, is the federally recognized anti-domestic violence coalition for the state of Utah. So there's a lot of things that we do. First and foremost, we are a team. So we work with a number of service providers, a number of organizations, even government organizations throughout the state of Utah, working with them, technical assistance, providing training, webinars, and so on and so forth. There are about 15 domestic violence service providers currently in Utah, and we work pretty closely with all of those organizations. All right, so now let's get right into what is the legal definition of domestic violence. All right, so the Utah state definition of domestic violence defines abuse is either intentionally or knowingly causing or attempting to cause a cohabitant physical harm, or intentionally or knowingly placing a cohabitant in reasonable fear of imminent physical harm. What are you noticing that is not included there? What are you noticing? You can just either raise your hand and I can unmute your mic, or you can type your response in that question box that's on the right-hand side of your screen. What do you think is missing? What's missing from that definition of abuse? See if we can get some folks to click on the answer box or the question box down there. I'll help you out a little bit here. See this? Notice how it says just physical harm, right? With us, folks who have worked with survivors of domestic and sexual violence, there's a lot of different ways that folks experience that abuse, that experience that harm, that are not simply physical, right? So this leaves out the emotional, the spiritual, sexual forms of violence that could potentially happen. This question down here is a question I get often. What is a cohabitant? Oftentimes we define cohabitant as someone we live with, or someone we're in a relationship with and we are also living with. But it's actually a little bit more defined than that, especially in the state of Utah. So if you see this, this is the actual language from our statute on how do we define cohabitant. So this, we're going to go over this. So basically someone who's 16 years or older, who is or was a spouse of the other party. That's really, really important. Is or was a spouse of the other party. Is or was living as if the spouse of another party. Is related by blood or marriage to the other party. So this is a little bit different. So we're gonna define that a little bit here at the bottom. So has or has had one or more children in common with the other party, is the biological parent of the other party's unborn child, resides or has resided in the same residence as the other party, and is or was in a consensual sexual relationship. So that last one was added this year, which is really important. A lot of folks may not live with the other party, but are dating and maybe engaging, in sexual relationship with that other person. And so they would fall under this law, this statute, which is great. So down here, if you look at the bottom, it defines what cohabitant does not include. So like natural parent to a minor, stuff like that. So that would fall under a different statute. It wouldn't fall under the domestic violence statute. Okay. If anyone has any questions on that, absolutely submit those to the question box on your webinar tool. All right, so this quote. Let me know if you agree with this. Let me know if you don't agree with this. Let's maybe have a little dialogue, maybe a little conversation about this. When it comes to damage, there is no real difference between physical, sexual, and emotional abuse. All that distinguishes one from another is an abuser's choice of weapons. Right? So there's different ways that folks can gain power and control over others, right? And sometimes folks use, strictly emotional abuse. Tell that person, beat them down, tell them how terrible they are, tell them how ugly, tell them, you look like, fat slut, all the time, and really beating them down. And sometimes it's maybe strictly physical, where they're just using that physicality to gain that power and control over another person. And then the sexual violence. Sexual violence is, often co-occurring with domestic violence. I've heard a quote, once that says, if it's, happening in the kitchen, chances are it's also happening in the bedroom. Right? All right, so here is a very, very short list of some signs of domestic violence in others. So while we go over this list, think of other signs of domestic violence, or other signs that someone is either experiencing domestic violence or maybe perpetrating domestic violence. Go ahead and write those in the question box on your control screen. So injuries and excuses. right? Think about, what do you think of when the term, the phrase domestic violence is spoken? What do you think when you first hear that, right? Is physical injury. We see, oftentimes we see pictures of bruises, pictures of black eyes, maybe even cuts, other, physical injuries. And then, you may hear the way folks define that, or the way folks even excuse that, say, oh, I fell down the stairs, or I ran into, a doorknob. And I think even those two reasons have been used extensively as, the butt of jokes in, sitcoms, TV series, and stuff like that, and even our colloquial speech in our, our everyday interactions with folks. Um, part of that excuse, the excuses that folks may make, is think about even embarrassment, right? We don't want to, admit that we're in this situation. We don't want to even have to talk about it with other folks. Like, that can be really hard, and it may not even be safe to talk about that. So maybe someone having low self-esteem. So think about having, say you have a friend, right? And that friend, is really outgoing. You go shopping together. You have a really, really lively, relationship, friendship, and you slowly start to see these changes in this person, where they are saying no more often, where when you call them on the phone, they don't talk as much, or they talk in a really, low voice, and they don't talk about their partner, or you don't see them physically anymore, right? Maybe even the things that they say. Say, you were going to go out to a movie, and they unfortunately, couldn't go. Maybe something happened with their kids. And when you talk about it later, they say, gosh, well, if I would have just done this, or, why couldn't I have just gone? Things like that. So that also talks about the personality changes, right? So going from going to shy or to quiet, or someone who stops making even eye contact, or when they are responding or answering your questions, or talking with you, their answers are very quick, they're rushed. Maybe they look around, or maybe they even look to someone else before they answer that question. Number 4 was like blaming themselves. We talked a little bit about this when we talked about that low self-esteem. So, blaming themselves even for the violence, like, oh, well, I should have just been watching what I was doing. If I would have this, and this, then it wouldn't have happened. Or uh, if I would have just gotten my stuff done, then I would have been able to go to the movies. Then the kids would have been able to go school shopping, right? And it's really difficult, because this blaming themselves is a really core piece. That blame is a really core piece, oftentimes, to domestic violence, is putting all the blame, all the responsibility on that survivor, that person that is experiencing that abuse, that violence, right? And of course, that isolation. Like, look at all these things that we've talked about, and how those can eventually lead to isolation, right? Having injuries, and having to make excuses. Maybe that person, that survivor, just doesn't go out anymore. It's like, I'm sick of, my brother asking about that. I'm sick of my, best friend asking about these bruises and these cuts that I have, and I just don't want to talk about it. It's just, I don't want to get in trouble. I don't want to get hurt anymore by talking about it. And then, of course, a partner that is controlling. And control can look different in different situations. Oftentimes, when we think about control, we think about, oh, someone literally grabbing someone physically and making them do something, or go somewhere, right? But control can look different in so many different situations. It could be even microaggressions, or saying, things like, oh, do you really want to go and hang out with your friends and take time away from your family? That statement isn't overtly controlling. It doesn't seem like, oh, well, you're not telling me that I can't do something, but what you're doing is you're adding that shame and that pressure to that person in being able to do that thing. All right, let's get to the next slide. There we go. So current rates and trends of domestic violence in the U.S. So on average, about 24 people per minute are victims of rape, physical violence, and or stalking by an intimate partner in the U.S. So let's do a little math. Now, as you know, my degrees, my degree is in psychology and women and gender studies. So let's see if I can do this. So we've been in this webinar for about 20 minutes, 24 people per minute. So just in the time that you have been hearing my voice, 480 people have been a victim of those three things. So that's a lot. You know, and even think about the course of a 40-hour training that you may have gone to, or even your 40-hour work week, right? Like that's a significant amount of people who are experiencing this, right? So that's about 12 million people a year. And then when we talk about rape, it's about 1 million people, 1 million women are raped a year in the US, and about 6 million folks are victims of stalking a year in the US. All right, so now let's see if you can guess this. Let's see if you know what the rates are in Utah for domestic violence. So a poll should pop up on your screen, and as soon as that is on your screen, just click the answer that you feel is the right one. So is it 1 in 3 women and 1 in 10 men? Is it 1 in 4 women and 1 in 3 men? Is it 1 in 3 women and 1 in 5 men? Or is it 1 in 4 women and 1 in 7 men? Or we just don't know. And that's a valid answer too, right? Maybe not all of us keep up on statistics as much as maybe I do, right? We got about 69% of folks that have voted. Let's see if we can get a couple more folks to vote there. I'll give you a couple more seconds here. All right, let's see what we got. Okay, those results should have popped up on your screen. All right, so, it looks like we have quite the spread. Okay, so 33% said 1 in 3 women, 1 in 10 men. 44% said 1 in 3 women, 1 in 5 men. 22% said 1 in 4 women and 1 in 7 men. So let's find out what the answer is. So it was C, which looks like 44% of folks said. So in Utah, 1 in 3 women and 1 in 5 men will experience domestic violence in their lifetime. So that's pretty significant numbers, right? Oftentimes when we hear, when we do hear about male victims, male survivors, we see higher numbers, 1 in 20, 1 in 50, and in reality the rates are pretty similar. All right, so now let's talk about the current rates and trends of domestic violence in Utah. So domestic violence in Utah, that rate has been pretty a lot higher than the US rate for about the last 5 years, right? And so we're seeing really interesting things happen in Utah. For example, we have at least 3 domestic violence related suicides a month in Utah. So think about the folks that will be affected by domestic violence related suicide. So not only survivors, right? Folks that feel like there's maybe no way out, feel like they can't, they just can't do it anymore, right? And then we have folks in like murder suicides, domestic violence related homicide, where folks may murder or kill the survivor, the victim, and then die by suicide after that event, after that murder. So we kind of, in Utah, we have an average of about 42% of all of our homicides in Utah are domestic violence related. So think about some of the things that you may have heard throughout your life, maybe even living in Utah, maybe, things that you believe, so and so, that Utah is a very safe place, right? Generally, we don't have, high rates of violent crime, stuff like that, right? But break this down. Think about this. Of the violent crime that we do have, a significant portion of it is related to domestic violence, right? So how do you define safety? How do you define if a place is safe, right? Is it because people aren't getting mugged, or is it because the rates are like? How do we define that, right? And this kind of goes into that myth portion of this presentation. Is a lot of folks don't see domestic violence as a violent crime, or something that would worry a community or would be dangerous to a community, when in reality domestic violence does affect communities pretty significantly. So we have a couple myths here. I want you all to think of any myths that aren't listed on here, and you can submit those in the question box on your control. All right, so number one is an anger management issue. We've probably maybe all heard this one, right? Well, they just have a hard time controlling their anger. They need to go to anger management, right? And so it's not uncommon for folks to be sentenced or sent to anger management. And what happens is now, folks have, maybe skills, the ability to now kind of mask the warning signs and kind of mask that a little bit better, right? So it's, in some cases, it could even make the situation worse, right? And then we have couples therapy as a cure-all, and we're going to combine that with bad relationship down here. So couples therapy is a cure-all, and the relationship is just bad. So this is putting that accountability on the relationship and that dynamic, rather than, the person who may have perpetrated that violence, that person with abusive behavior. So the person with that behavior is not being held accountable. The survivor is being held accountable for that abuse as well, and that is greatly problematic. And then, of course, alcohol and drugs. This is a pretty common myth, about as common as the anger management myth. We assume that people, they do bad things when they drink or when they're on drugs, right? And sometimes some people do, right? However, you have to have those behaviors, those beliefs, which is a big one, those ways of thinking, the ways of behaving, acting, interacting, even manipulating folks, before you involve drugs and alcohol. So drugs and alcohol can intensify situations. However, they are not the cause of, think about everyone who maybe smokes marijuana or, drinks alcohol, maybe has, a glass of wine, or goes, out, have, a drink maybe with dinner. They don't, generally get violent, right? They don't generally have an incident. So down here, we're going to go to an isolated incident. So this is really interesting. So this isolated incident. So basically, we have this idea. So think about this. Random reinforcement patterns, right? And I have a little pen down here if you can see it. So say, we got into a relationship, right? Oh, this person's so great. They're so wonderful. They're so attractive. They're so smart. I just love being with them, right? They're great. They tell me how great I am every day. They buy me gifts. I'm the smartest person they've ever been with. It's great. We're connecting really well. They've met, my family. Everything's going great. And then we have an incident, right? Okay, so that's unusual. That's not like them. I don't know what's happening. Okay. Well, they brought me flowers, or oh, they made my favorite dinner. They made my steak just the way I like it. You know, they've been coming up with really cute dates, really cute things for us to do, and then it happens again, right? All right, so that's okay. Um, you know, that's not like them. This is so weird. They must have had a bad day at work. We're starting, you know, to see that honeymoon period, them kind of reconnecting, right? And then it happens again. So it's really difficult for folks to connect these instances because we have these lulls, because we have these places of happiness. So because it's not a linear event, and you know these events are very similar, but these events that are happening between are not. That folks have a hard time connecting that, right? And that's why it's you know part of that difficulty to leave is because we don't know when the next punishment is going to happen. We don't know when the next reinforcement is going to happen, right? And you know these behaviors, these you know, grooming is a really big part of domestic violence. You know, if you've heard of love bombing, where you know it's really interesting because it happens a lot in like cults, but also you know with like domestic violence, you meet someone and you're the smartest person they've ever met. You're so hot, you're so beautiful, you're so great. They couldn't you know imagine life without you, right? That feels wonderful. Heck yeah, you know, that would feel great that someone would want that thinks you're just you know the best, the greatest person, you know, the bee's knees, right? But in reality, when we put folks on pedestals, and then you know, and then they are unfortunately set up to fail. So think about that idea of grooming. Grooming is a really big part of this isolation piece. Grooming is a really big part of domestic violence. Okay, so they must like it, right? So this is like, oh well, if you haven't left, then you must like it. There must be a reason why you're staying, right? When in reality, there are many reasons why someone may stay, but it's not usually because they like it, right? It's because there's so many barriers. There you know may not even be a way out for folks. This myth that it's just a family issue, you know, that oh that's something that you know is in their family, they need to figure that out. That's not um, our responsibility. We don't you know we don't need to deal with that. Or even when folks assume that it happens in a certain type of family, right? um, some of the you know comment to me here is like, oh that's just what those people do, or that's just what they do, when in reality that's you know generally untrue. So it only happens to folks that are you know women who live in poverty, who you know have mental illness, or only folks who perpetrate have mental illness, right? This last second to last one is that it's a right. So you know think about the idea of folks you know maybe not believing that spousal rape, you know spousal violence even not only even happens, but that it's just part of the marriage, right? Is that we're married, so if one partner wants to have sex, then it means that they have sex, right? When in reality, marriage certificates are not blanket consent forms, right? Is that person, that survivor, you know, the people within that relationship have the ability to consent each and every time during each and every interaction. Okay. Um, the good bad dichotomy, right? So this is really, really interesting. So this is the idea that um, you know good people don't love bad people, right? And the idea, you know, if you're good, then the person that you're with must be good, right? Because good people, they don't fall in love with bad people. Good people don't love bad people, right? And because you know we're essentially good people, we're inherently good people, um, that the person I love must be good too, but they just do bad things, right? And so it's really, really interesting, and this plays a part in many of the myths, even like the excuses and denial, is, we don't want to admit that the person that we love, the person that we care about, does bad things, right? Because that essentially could reflect bad upon us, right? So it's this really, really interesting, phenomena, this really interesting thing. I want you to keep that in mind, especially when you listen to other webinars that we have. This good bad dichotomy is a really big part of that, even part of the domestic violence dynamic. Okay, so this common question, why don't they just leave? And this picture here is kind of a really good representation of that, right? It's like, why don't they just leave? Well, if it was as easy as that, then people probably would leave, right? Then we wouldn't really have this big issue with domestic violence as we do, right? But there's so many things that are a part of this. There's so many barriers that keep that person within that relationship and make it really difficult for that person to leave, right? So on average, it takes a survivor or a victim of domestic violence about 7 times before they leave an abusive relationship. So think about that person, leaving that relationship. Do they feel safe, right? Not only do they feel safe in the place that they're currently living in, if it's emergency shelter, maybe it's with friends, family, so on. Do they, feel physically safe? And if they do they feel emotionally safe? Are they worried that, the person that may have perpetrated this violence upon them could find them, could know where they are, could do something to kids, family, house, and so on, right? So it's a lot more complicated. Think about why someone may not leave, right? That what barriers might that person face? We're going to talk about that in just a sec. Okay, so this is a question that I would love to hear your responses to. So, when is the most dangerous time for a victim of domestic violence? When do you think is the most dangerous time for that person? So the poll should have popped right up. So the first is when the abuse starts, right? Or when police get involved. Number 3 would be right before or right after the victim leaves. The fourth option is the entire relationship if domestic violence is involved. And then the fifth answer is unknown or other. All right, looks like we got about 60% of folks. And if there's anyone else who wants to submit different answers, go ahead and type that into the question box. And if you're having a hard time finding your question box, there should be a little arrow that is pointing either left or right. And if it's pointing left, then that means that you're able to expand the question box. All right, so let's get this shared with y'all. All right, so, oh wow, yeah. So it looks like 78% of folks said right before or right after the victim leaves, and then 22% said the entire relationship is if domestic violence is involved. So the answer, and we're going to talk a little bit, go into more detail about this a little later, but is right before or right after that victim leaves. Why do you think that would be the most dangerous time for a victim, is right before they leave or right after they leave? I'm going to give you a second to submit an answer within that question box. So why do you think that's the most dangerous time for that survivor to leave? Why do you think it's the most dangerous time for that survivor to leave? And if you can't see the question box, make sure to click on that little arrow that's on your webinar control panel, and it will open up the entire panel for you. And you'll be able to download the PDF version of the PowerPoint we're going over today, and also be able to ask a question. So ask a question or submit a question. So go ahead and write in there. Why do you think that is the most dangerous time for a survivor? Oh, we got some answers. It looks like escalation. So maybe that when that person is leaving or is trying to leave, that it escalates the situation. So maybe the person who is trying to get or gain power and control over another person, gets upset. The person that they have power and control over is all of a sudden gone, right? And so they feel like they've lost control. They feel like they don't have control of this situation. The person, things maybe in their life. Yeah, excellent. If anyone else wants to send any more in there, you absolutely can. So leaving is dangerous, right? So not only can it increase it can escalate that physical violence, but it also, kind of leaves that person with abusive behavior, like they have no idea what's going on, right? And so they respond, they react in maladaptive ways, in very negative ways. So if that survivor, if that person, that victim is planning on leaving, it's definitely best to do it when that partner, the person that has perpetrated the violence upon them, is not home or not in that shared space, and to avoid sharing that with partner, because when we avoid sharing that, when we talk about it, that could even avoid a escalation of that violence. So it kind of leaves out a situation where it could become more aggressive, become more violent, right? And it's super, super important to remember that sometimes staying is safer than leaving. Sometimes staying is safer than leaving, especially if leaving means you could potentially lose your life, right? So if you if you get yelled at, on a daily basis, get pushed around, maybe slapped, it, that could be safer than literally risking your life or your children's life, right? And unfortunately, that is something that is all too common within Utah, right? So here's a couple reasons, why folks, just don't leave. Here's some of the barriers that folks may experience when they are, trying to leave or in a domestic violence situation. So of course, lack of capacity at shelters. And if anyone has any other ones that they'd like to add, you can either raise your hand or you can submit in that question box. So limited victim services, right? So think about, in Utah, we have 29 counties and we have 15 domestic violence service providers. So, that's half of the counties that we have. There are some shelters that serve 5 counties, right? So think about that. Like, do folks even have transportation? Do they have a way to get to shelter, to get to services? What about lack of access to behavioral health services? Right? Think about even how that would affect domestic violence related suicide, right? Even in more metro areas like Salt Lake, Ogden, Provo, that finding a therapist, it could take 6 to 8 weeks before you're able to get in with that therapist. And are you going to be compatible with that therapist? Is that therapist culturally competent, right? So think about, maybe, LGBTQ survivors. Think about undocumented survivors. Think about survivors that English is not their first language, right? Not only does that person speak that language, but is that person even a part of that community, or does that person have experience with the community, right? So a lack of awareness of resources. So even think about when you heard about this webinar. Think about maybe some of the other webinars, or even the other services or things that are around you that you just didn't even know about, right? Lack of financial means. One of the things that Utah is struggling with pretty substantially right now is affordable housing, right? So affordable housing is really difficult to come by, right? And that's, across the state. And with, 70% of folks experiencing homelessness living in Salt Lake County, that can be really, really difficult to find places to live, find safe places to live, find places to live that folks can afford, right? And then that kind of goes into the unmet needs of children, right? So do the children have food, shelter, water? Do they have a stable place to sleep, a stable place to live? Are they being, emotionally supported? Is this generational cycle of abuse affecting them? Are they able to connect with someone? Are they able to get the supports that they need, right? And we do need to remember that folks who are in relationships, folks who may have partners with abusive behavior, that victim, that survivor, still has an emotional attachment with that person, or a connection with that person, may love that person, right? So think about when we talked about the good bad dichotomy, right? Is that we can't just cut off our emotions. We can't just cut off our connections. Humans are very social creatures. Humans crave connections with other humans, right? And it's a very important and beneficial part of human emotional and even physical health is being connected with other people, right? So think about that, right? Sometimes you'll hear folks say like, well, how can you love that person if they're hitting you? How can you love that person if they're calling you names all day? When that's part of it, is that connection, that person, that love, falling in love and being connected to that person, maybe before that abuse started, or just realizing that that's part of human attachment, human connection, right? So privilege, right? So privilege can be a really big part of it, right? That folks, come from different walks of life. Folks may have different privileges, have privileges that, or even identities that give them privilege or benefits in other areas of their life, but not in relation to being a victim of a crime or being a victim of domestic violence. So they may not be able to reach out. They may not be able to have help or have someone help them. And lastly, think about criminal record. How many survivors have you worked with that have criminal records, right? How many survivors have you worked with that have also been charged with offending of domestic violence or child abuse, right? So what if your survivor, the survivor that you're working with, what if they do have a felony, right? How difficult is that to get them housing, to get them the jobs, right? Okay, so now we're going to kind of segue into this discussion about understanding folks who may have perpetrated, right? And so kind of understanding this behavior, right? Like controlling behavior. It could, look like arguments or decision making, seem like either taking away personal freedom or that person with abusive behavior having, their personal freedom, well, I should be able to have sex with whoever I want because that's who I am and that's, what I want. And you just have to deal with it. We're married, right? Even parenting, controlling how the other person parents, or being, controlling parent themselves, right? Down here at the bottom left, feeling like the victim, right? Well, if you wouldn't have done this, then I wouldn't have had to hit you. If you wouldn't have scratched the car when you went to the grocery store, then I wouldn't have, have to have, pushed you down the stairs, right? And this, gaslighting is a big part of that. One of the definitions that I generally hear in my training is folks say, the other person makes you feel, quote unquote crazy, right? They make you second guess yourself, right? They're saying, no, it didn't happen that way, or why would I do that to you? When when you experienced that thing actually happening, but your lived experience and the way that they are recounting or talking to you about that experience are very different, right? And that's really difficult because that puts the survivor in a place where either they believe themselves, stand up for themselves, and know their truth, but that means that you go against partner, which could unfortunately escalate and lead to further violence, or you believe the lie and you believe partner and you second guess yourself, right? And that's a really, really difficult place to put folks in. That's a really, really difficult place for folks to be in, right? So feelings of entitlement, right? Feeling entitlement to that person in a number of different ways, right? It's, yeah, really, really interesting. Kind of goes hand in hand oftentimes with like controlling, right? And then we have down here at the bottom right, disrespecting the victim and considers himself like superior, right? Which, very interesting because when we see, folks who may have abusive behavior feeling like the victim, but then they also feel superior to that survivor, it's very, very kind of interesting, like false dichotomy that we have there, right? Folks may confuse love with abuse, right? There could be a number of reasons for this. Tune into the Beauty and the Beast and Twilight, How We Socially Normalize Domestic Abuse webinar. That's also available on our YouTube page. And it talks a lot about this. It talks about these narratives, right? These romance narratives, and how oftentimes abusive behaviors and situations are seen as love, is seen as romantic, right? And maybe even, a person who has a history of intergenerational like abuse, child abuse, sexual violence as a youth may, maybe that can come from that in some cases as well. Deny and minimizing their abuse, right? Think about that good bad dichotomy, right? I'm a good person. I'm not a bad person. I just maybe sometimes do bad things, but it's okay. It just happens. But I'm still a good person, right? And that this idea of striving to have a good public image. So a big part of domestic violence is that isolation, right? A big part of that domestic violence is hiding that domestic violence, right? Not only does the survivor not want people to know, right? But the person with abusive behavior doesn't want people to know, right? That can change the way people see them. That can change the way that they navigate, interact, and engage with the outside world, right? That is something that if you look like you're happy on the outside, people aren't going to think that there's severe abuse happening. People aren't going to think that your neighbor, when they come home, they tell their partner how terrible they are and how they wish that they would just die, right? And then, of course, that possession, that possessive feelings that the other person belongs to them, and that has a lot to do with even the entitled piece. I hope you're starting to see how all these things interact with each other, and they kind of create that cycle of abuse, right? So now we're going to talk a little bit about trauma-informed care, how to respond The difference between validation and, even rejecting or harmful responses. So first part of this is power and control wheel, right? Power and control wheel is an awesome resource. Oftentimes, advocates folks will use it when they're working with a survivor, and it's a great visual aid. Like, being in a situation, maybe not understanding what's happening, but knowing that it's not healthy and it's not okay. And having this put in front of you, and you're like, oh, wow, I had no idea, right? That these, kind of break down the way that this person may have been abusive or may have been gaining that power and control over me, right? And then on this slide, on the left-hand side, we have the power and control wheel, and then on the right-hand side, we have the equality wheel. So the equality wheel is really interesting. It basically, like opposite, right? Kind of like an opposite of the power and control wheel. But what it does is it defines what healthy relationships look like. Think about your junior high years, your high school years, your pre-college years. And think about, did I have a class where we went over healthy relationships? Have I ever had those conversations about consent, right? Can I define consent? Think about even, folks, working within the field, working with survivors, working with victims of crime. We may understand, a nuanced, definition of consent, and maybe understand, what kind of consent could be, but can we actually define it, right? Can we define what a healthy relationship is? Oftentimes when I do trainings, I hear folks say, they don't hit me. And it's like, oh, so is a healthy relationship a relationship where they don't hit you? Or is it, maybe a relationship where there's mutual, trust and support, where folks are negotiating, they're sharing responsibility, right? And how different that can look, right? Of course, not being physically attacked is definitely a part of a healthy relationship. Okay, so blaming versus supportive responses. Okay, so think about a time that you were going through a difficult situation, you were struggling with something, and you went to someone. How did they respond? Did they validate your experiences? Did they tell you your feelings were valid? Did they thank you for sharing that with them? Did they tell you that your feelings were normal? Or did they ask you questions like, well, why didn't you just lock your car, right? Or why did you have a bag in the front seat of the car if you didn't want someone to break into your car while you were hiking, right? So how did that person respond? And think about ways that you have responded to people when they've told you something that has been meaningful, that has been painful, even a trauma that they've experienced. How did you respond, right? Okay, so I want to know what you think is the most, the validating response. What's a validating response that you could say to someone? That poll should show up on your screen here in a second, and just click whatever answer you feel is best. So which one do you feel is validating? Maybe which one do you feel is the most validating? We have 5 different answers you can choose from. First one is, I understand what you're going through. Second one is, thank you for telling me. I can only imagine what that's like. Third, you don't deserve that. When are you going to leave? Fourth answer you can choose from, have you tried to reach out to their family? And the fifth one, I'm sorry that happened. What can I do to support you? All right, so we have about 53% of folks voted. We're going to give you just a little bit more time to get that answered, and then we're going to move on. just click the answer that you feel is the best one. All right, let's get the results. There we go. All right, so it looks like we had about 13% of folks say, thank you for telling me. I can only imagine what that's like. And the fifth one would be, I'm sorry that happened. What can I do to support you? If you could think of any other ones, pop them into that question box. Um, any other supportive or validating responses. So the first one, I understand what you're going through. A lot of times folks do want to just say that, like, oh, I understand that. Like, I understand what you're going through, and here's what you should do, right? But in reality, we can't understand what someone else is going through. Even though their situation might be similar to something we have experienced in our past or we are currently experiencing, that person is going to experience it differently than we will, right? And especially as service providers, think about how differently we would navigate a relationship with the skills and resources and stuff that we have, right? And even the education. The second one, thank you for telling me. I can only imagine what that's like. So that can, be a validating response. Is, thank you for sharing something that was deeply painful with you or with me. When was the last time someone thanked you for sharing something that was difficult to talk about, right? I can only imagine what that feels like, right? And of course, you can follow up with that is, you're not alone. What can I do to support you, right? And the third one, you don't deserve that. When are you going to leave? So that, I'm glad no one selected that one. So that definitely would be some victim blaming there, right? And in this fourth one, have you tried to reach out to their family? It's kind of minimizing. It's like, okay, you just said all this stuff to me, but have you done this, right? It kind of invalidates everything that they just previously told you, right? Generally, folks, when they come to you, they want to be heard. They want to tell their story, right? They want to be able to verbalize what has happened to them and process that, right? Verbal processing is a thing. And maybe that, folks don't want advice. They just want to be heard, right? And so that's really important that we make sure that we offer resources, we offer assistance when that person wants it, right? And that we're not pushing upon them or telling them what they should and shouldn't do. And then the last one, I'm sorry that happened. What can I do to support you, right? That question, what can I do to support you? That's huge. Think about, when was the last time someone said that to you? When was the last time that someone asked you how you would like to be supported, right? All right. So now, when you're speaking to a victim, speaking to a survivor, right? Say someone calls, maybe someone comes in, right? I know when, for example, when I get calls and people leave voicemails and they ask for calls back, when I call them back, I say, oh, hey, my name is Andy. I'm just returning a call, right? Think about how differently that, can sound like, or how maybe more dangerous it can be if I say, oh, hey, this is Andy Tremonti from the Utah Domestic Violence Coalition. I'm calling you to ask about or to follow up with the severe abuse that you're experiencing, right? I don't know who's on the phone. I don't know who answered, right? I don't know if it's on speakerphone, right? And so I ask, or I introduce myself in a very basic way, in a way that that person who called me and asked me to call them back would probably understand. Oh, Andy, and you're returning my call. Okay, I called you yesterday, right? And then the next thing I ask is it safe to talk, right? And if that person says, oh yeah, today's, it's a perfect time to talk. Or if they don't answer, or if they answer very quietly, or they answer in a very strange or unusual way, I can get that's information that's saying to me, hey, this person may not be able to talk right now, so go to a different line of conversation. So ask, oh, hey, can I, call you back tomorrow? Or will you be able to, can you call me back whenever you're available, right? And when you're, talking with that person, asking, open-ended questions, allowing them to explain, allowing them to talk and process it in the way that works for them, right? Um, don't you want to avoid like overly personal questions. So, for example, when you're asking someone a question, think about, is this information that I need to know to serve this person, or is this information I want to know because I'm curious? So oftentimes this comes with, happens when working with like transgender survivors, survivors from the LGBTQ community, is that we want to ask questions, about genitals or transition, or, what was your previous name? What is your debt? All these different things. When in reality, those questions, you don't need to know the answers to those questions to be able to serve that person, right? And think about, would you ever ask a survivor about their genitals? Would you ever ask a survivor some of these questions? And so kind of think, hey, is this me wanting to know this information and I can seek out this information in a different source? Or is it because I need the information to, provide services, right? And of course, active listening, say things like, um, ask clarifying questions, repeating what they say, say, oh, I just want to make sure I understand. Were you in the kitchen? Okay, thank you, right? Things like that. Let's see. If you're if we look on the presentation on the right-hand side, so when you're asking questions, I know some folks may work with folks who are experiencing homelessness, and think about the questions that are in HMIS when you're asking, you're going through the questions in the survey, and you're getting that information to be able to serve that person, and the domestic violence questions come up, right? Is it possible to ask those questions without that person being there? Can you skip that question and wait until the end, come back and ask to talk with just that one person, right? Because again, if we talk or ask about domestic violence in front of someone's partner, similar to when someone victim or survivor wants to leave, that they don't inform their partner, is that if you ask in front of that partner with abusive behavior, in front of that partner who may have perpetrated that violence against that victim or survivor, even you asking that question, right, that survivor can experience some violence because of it. Like, what did you do to make them think that they had or they needed to ask you that question? Or if you answer the question in the way that that person, that partner didn't like, or, made them look bad, that, there can be some violence there, right? So really, really be mindful about these domestic violence questions. Really, really be mindful. And you don't want to assume that, say, you meet with someone and, he has another man with him, and so you assume like, oh, that's just his friend. But in reality, that could definitely, be his partner. And for you asking, about the domestic violence in front of them can be really, really impactful and really dangerous for that person. If anyone has any questions about that, definitely ask them, and we can go over it. Okay, so all the things that we just went over, listen, acknowledge and validate, and respect their choices, right? If they don't want to do a safety plan, if they would rather do a safety plan over the phone than with you in person, then, respect those choices, because it may, they know their situation. They know the ins and outs of what's happening. And so they know if it's safe or not, right? So if they are not ready to do something, or if there's something that they want to do that you feel they shouldn't do, you can express concern, but remember that when we're making decisions for them and when we're telling them what they should and shouldn't do, we're creating that power and control dynamic, right? All right. Okay, so if you come in contact with that person with abusive behavior, the person who may have perpetrated the violence, it's really important that you're setting appropriate boundaries, and especially, not validating or even colluding with that person. So, for example, even like nodding your head or saying, "Oh, yeah, that makes sense," can be a way that that person with abusive behavior may feel like their actions or experiences or things that they've done or said are validated or okay. We actually had this happen a couple times when we have been tabling as a coalition, is folks coming up to us and telling the things that they've done to a partner, and saying like, well, that isn't domestic violence, right? Because I've only been doing it for a couple weeks. When in reality, that it doesn't matter the time frame. If those behaviors are if you're gaining power and control over someone, then that would be domestic violence. So yeah, and make sure not to excuse these behaviors like, oh, it sounds like you were just really stressed. Well, think about the last time you were stressed. When you were stressed, did you go and punch or sexually assault your partner? So think about that, right? That we're not excusing those behaviors. And so lastly, we're going to talk about lethality and safety planning. So we've talked a little bit about lethality, and even when we talk about validation, we kind of cover a couple of things in the safety planning best practices, right? So here's some numbers on lethality. So these are Utah numbers, right? So we know that women in Utah are 10 times more likely to die by domestic violence related homicide, right? Just think about in the last month how many domestic violence related incidents, even homicides, that you have heard about or that you know about, right? And we know that not all of them are covered in the media. We know that not all of them are talked about, right? So of homicides of women, so femicides, 70%, so more than 70% of femicides are domestic violence related. So women are more likely to be killed by a partner than any other person, right? So if you or your organization have gone through the LAP training or are a LAP partner, the lethality assessment protocol. So basically these are some of the risk factors, and these are the top 5 risk factors for lethality from the LAP, but from the Maryland model, right? So number 1, has the abuser ever used or threatened to use a gun, knife, or other weapon against the victim? So think about that like threatening someone, how close that is to actually doing, right? And threatening can cause harm, can cause so much fear and control, over someone, right? Second one, threaten to kill or injure victim, right? This third one, a lot of people overlook it. The strangulation, right? Has partner ever tried to strangle or has strangled the victim? It's almost 10 times more likely to die. That's really, really high. Think about even strangulation in general, right? So think about the power and control a person has when they literally have, their hands over your breathing, your airway, right? Your ability to stay alive, right? That is absolutely frightening. That is absolutely, some places, some states, jurisdictions will charge it as attempted, murder or aggravated assault. It's very, very interesting how that gets overlooked. Number 4, abusers violently or constantly jealous, right? So think about that idea of jealousy within our even, the entertainment, the things that you watch, the songs that you listen to, the books that you read, how jealousy or being even obsessed with someone, how just wanting to be by them or upset that they're talking to other people and that they're not talking to them, how that's, considered sexy or attractive because it's like, oh, this person wants me so bad. Oh, this person just can't get enough of me because they just love me so much, right? How that has been romanticized, how it's seen as sexy as part of love, but in reality, that is very, very dangerous. And of course, number 5, as the abuser of a forced victim to have sex. Yeah, forcing someone to have sex, sexual violence is a a very powerful way to gain power and control over someone, right? So safety planning. It's really interesting because when I talk to folks about safety planning, and I ask the question, have you ever safety planned before? Oftentimes, people either don't raise their hand or say, oh no, I've never safety planned before, right? But in reality, every one of us has safety planned before. Have you ever looked at the traffic before you go to work? Have you ever talked to your kids before, you send them off to school? Right? Have you ever planned for a camping trip or a hiking trip? Like those are all ways that we're safety planning, right? When we're looking at the traffic, we're safety planning. Like, hey, maybe it isn't safe to take I-15 this morning, so I'm going to take 89, right? And part of safety planning is it's dynamic, it's interactive, right? It's survivor focused, survivor led, right? Is that what we're trying to do is we're trying to maximize that safety, right? We're trying to minimize that harm, right? So it does have elements of risk reduction in it, right? And a big part of why safety planning is so important is that we are talking about potential situations and solutions or ways that we can get out, the ways that we can increase our safety in those situations, right? So remember that safety planning is unique for each person. So, I mean, we've probably, maybe all seen the safety planning forms. They do have, pretty basic general safety planning forms, which can be really great, right? Especially for a survivor to be able to look back at those. But, think about the survivors that you're working with. If a survivor doesn't have employment, that you don't have to, you shouldn't force that survivor to, safety plan for employment. If they don't want to, if they don't feel like they need to, then making sure that we're not forcing them or telling them that they need to, or they're going to be put, in harm, right? And also understanding that when you're serving underserved communities, such as LGBTQ, folks who are undocumented, communities of color, folks where English isn't their first language, folks experiencing homelessness, living with disabilities, is that the safety planning is going to be a little bit different. So think about folks that are underserved, folks that comes from marginalized communities, marginalized identities, is that there's going to probably be shared resources, shared community centers. So when you're safety planning with that person, it may just be a form of safer planning rather than safety planning, because unfortunately in reality, that person may interact with that partner with abusive behavior, that partner who may have perpetrated the violence upon them. They may interact because they share the same spaces, right? And remember, safety planning can be done at any time, regardless of if they're going to leave or not. It can be a 5-minute conversation with someone, and it can be a formal written safety plan, right? And remember, tailor it to that survivor's needs, because each person has different needs, right? So, for example, planning for a quick exit, right? So, having maybe a suitcase packed, having, keys, hygiene items, clothes, documents, right? So you can put copies of prescriptions, medical records, birth certificates, social security cards, court documents. If you're dealing with transgender folks, maybe if they are transitioning, transition-related items. If they have a legal name change or gender change, then totally include that. If not, maybe the doctor's notes, right? So if they haven't gotten those legal changes, then include the things that could make it easier for them to actually do that. Think about, folks who are maybe going through citizenship or naturalization process, folks who are undocumented, having those documents, the information, so that they can be able to access it at a later date, or make sure that they have their documents and even passports collected from, that partner, or maybe the person who has perpetrated upon them. Let's see. Okay, so folks who may stay with that partner, folks who don't, want to risk being killed. Maybe they have been threatened and they don't want to leave right now, right? Or they don't feel safe leaving. Is that we are still, can still safety plan with them, and they can still have that bag packed, and they can leave it at a friend's house, a coworker's house, right? Even folks can leave a bag even at a gym. So some gyms, a lot of gyms, you'll see a sign that says, lockers can only be locked or used for 24 hours, right? So go and have a conversation with that the gym manager. Talk to the owner and say, hey, we have this, a situation. Can I hold this here for 2 days and I'll be able to pick it up, right? And generally folks are pretty understanding, especially with the folks that I've been able to work with. We've had really good outcomes with that. Also, another good thing could be hiding it in plain sight, right? So think about, how many of us have bookshelves somewhere in our house, right? And how many of us have books or folders or documents, whatever, in there, right? That we've had success with survivors having all their important documents in, say, a book or a folder or something in that bookshelf. So something that they pass every single day, something that that partner passes every single day, right? But when you need to make a quick exit, literally, you can, as you're walking out of the door, you can grab that book, you can grab whatever, and you have all your documents and all your kids' documents, right? So community resources. There are a number of resources available in Utah. So for example, here's a little resource wheel, kind of a list. So the community resources that we have available would be like victim services. So going to a domestic violence service provider, family support centers, legal services. There are a number of organizations that offer free or discounted legal services, right? So there are services that are out there, and a lot of them are not as well known as others, right? Mental health system, justice system, and medical stuff like that. So victim advocates are greatly beneficial for folks who are experiencing intimate partner violence, not only because the folks that have been killed by their partner, only 4% engaged with an advocate, and we're engaging with an advocate. So we know that advocates are needed, and they're greatly beneficial as resources and supports for survivors. There's a number of different things that advocates do, and advocates do a lot more than people may think, right? They can absolutely help survivors through the system. Think not only protective orders, but think about requests for restitution, stalking injunctions, communicating with court personnel, and even understanding how the court system and the legal system work, right? So there's a couple differences between the types of advocates that we have. So we have systems-based advocates, so like government advocates, police station, county, stuff like that. So they generally work with all victims of crime. Confidentiality is going to be a bit limited. It's going to be very different than VAWA confidentiality. So Violence Against Women Act confidentiality is very strict. And that's generally what domestic violence services providers fall under. So systems-based advocates are an excellent resource when interacting with the criminal justice system. That is what they do. That is what they know best. So this is a wonderful tool, and especially help protect victims' rights through that process, right? Through that legal process. And then the community-based advocates, basically serve all folks, all survivors, all victims, whether they go to court or whether they interact with that criminal justice system or not, right? So generally these services are confidential and oftentimes they're statutorily defined. So that's really great because the confidentiality is pretty strict. And so generally, especially with folks who adhere to VAWA confidentiality, you literally you need nothing, you have to at least have like a subpoena to even share information, and oftentimes even a subpoena won't allow for information sharing. Community-based advocates can be a great resource for folks who serving folks who are undocumented because they don't interact with the criminal justice system. And there are a little bit more protections there, especially with VAWA. All right, so here is the National Domestic Violence Hotline. You will have a copy of this. Make sure to download it on your control panel. That is where you'll be able to get that PDF. And here's the information for the link line. This is the 24-hour, 7-day-a-week crisis line, domestic violence line for the state of Utah, and it is run through this office. Sam is our link line coordinator, and if you have any questions, you can get a hold of her via our website. Also, the link line, if you have any questions, even as a service provider, as an advocate, say you're working with someone and you don't know what the next steps are, you're having a hard time finding this, and this resource, call the link line, call them. Literally has binders full of information for multiple parts in rural areas throughout the state. So give them a call, visit us online. There's a lot more resources out there that you may even know of. So here, of course, is my information. You will receive an email after this webinar tomorrow, and it will have some more information, and then also it will give you a copy of the actual recording of this webinar so you can go over it. Additionally, reach out to our YouTube page. We have all of our webinars on there, usually the day after the recording. The Domestic Violence 101, Domestic Violence 102, and there's a couple other ones we offer quarterly, so those ones will not appear the day after because we already have them on the YouTube. But generally, check back on the YouTube, check your email for additional resources. If you have any questions, stay on. I will stay on here for a couple more minutes and answer those questions. You can either raise your hand or you can type a question in that question box. Other than that, it was wonderful to spend the last hour and a half with you, and I hope you learned something. I hope that you got a bunch from this webinar, and I will see you next time. Thank you, and have a wonderful day. Yeah, you could download on, let's see, on your right hand side, you have this little box. and it looks like it has 4 buttons. The top button is an arrow that is pointing to the left. The one below it is a microphone, a muted microphone. The third one down is you can change the view to a window mode, or you can maximize the window. The bottom one is a raise hand. You can raise your hand for that. Also, if you click on that little arrow, it'll open up the full panel, and you will be able to download the handout, check your speakers, do sound checks, also ask questions, and get messages from the presenters and stuff. So okay, it looks like, let's see.